I lived alone in a quiet suburban neighborhood, in a house that had never given me any reason to feel unsafe. It was a modest but comfortable place. 2 bedrooms, a small backyard, and an open living space. It had been my home for 3 years, and in all that time, I had never experienced anything unusual. That changed about a month ago. It started with noises in the hallway. At first, I dismissed them as the house settling, or maybe even my imagination playing tricks on me. A soft creak, a faint shuffle, nothing too alarming. But as the nights passed, the sounds became more distinct. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving just outside my bedroom door. I would lie in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear beyond the hum of the heater. Each time I mustered the courage to check, I found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no open windows, just silence and the lingering sense that I was not alone. Then, one night, I woke up to something different. It wasn't just the footsteps this time. There was a sound of movement like fabric brushing against the walls. My pulse quickened. I reached for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and swung my legs over the bed. The hallway outside my room was empty, as always. But the air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't explain. The feeling stayed with me long after I returned to bed. The next morning, I decided to check the security cameras. I had installed them more for peace of mind than actual necessity. My neighborhood was safe, and I had never had a reason to rely on them before. But as I scrolled through the footage, my stomach twisted. The camera in the hallway had caught something. At 3:12 a.m., the footage showed my bedroom door slowly creaking open. The door had not moved on its own. There was no draft, no visible force pushing it. It simply opened, as if someone had turned the knob from the outside. Then, after a long pause, it closed again. I stared at the screen, my breath shallow. The timestamp showed I had been awake at that time, listening to those sounds. But the footage showed nothing, no one, nothing entering or leaving. Just my door opening, then shutting. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the door hadn't fully latched. Maybe there was a change in pressure from the heater turning on. But deep down, I knew those explanations didn't fit. Doors don't unlatch themselves. And they certainly don't close again without assistance. I told myself it was a one-time occurrence. But that night, I locked my bedroom door. And that was the night things got worse. Around 3 a.m., I woke up again. This time, there was no mistaking what I heard. The sound of slow, steady breathing. Not mine. Someone else's. I froze, my ears straining. The breathing was just outside my bedroom door. Deep, deliberate, and unhurried. My fingers tightened around the edge of my blanket. The doorknob rattled once, softly. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Then, after a long, agonizing pause, the breathing stopped. The footsteps receded down the hall. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked the cameras again. My hands shook as I scrolled through the footage. And there it was. At 3:07 a.m., the doorknob turned. The handle pressed down. But the door did not open, it was locked this time. The footage showed the knob twisting back and forth, slowly, as if someone on the other side was testing it. And then nothing. No retreating figure. No footsteps. Just the eerie stillness of my empty hallway. I knew then that I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't alone in this house. Someone else was here. And they didn't want to be seen. I didn't know what to do. The footage was right there, clear as day. Something or someone had tried to enter my bedroom in the middle of the night. But there was no one to be seen. No shadow. No silhouette. Just that twisting doorknob. I couldn't call the police. What would I even say? Hey, I think my house might be haunted. But there's no proof of an intruder? They'd either laugh or tell me to get some sleep. And maybe that was part of the problem. Maybe I was sleep-deprived, paranoid. I hadn't been getting much rest lately, after all. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't in my head. This was real. That night, I took precautions. I locked my door again, placed a heavy chair in front of it, and kept a baseball bat by my bed. If someone tried to get in, I'd hear them. I'd be ready. The house was silent for most of the night. No footsteps. No breathing. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Around 2:50 a.m., my exhaustion finally took over, and I drifted into a light sleep. But I woke up suddenly to a noise that made my stomach drop. The sound of something dragging across the floor came from the hallway right outside my room. A slow, deliberate scraping, like someone was pulling something heavy along the wooden planks. I held my breath, clutching the bat, my hands sweaty. Then the doorknob rattled again. Once, twice, and then nothing. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. I couldn't bring myself to move, to check, to do anything except sit there in the darkness and wait. Eventually, the first hints of morning light filtered through my curtains. Only then did I dare to get up. I slowly pushed the chair aside and unlocked the door. The hallway was empty. No sign of anything unusual. But when I looked down at the floor, my blood turned to ice. Faint streaks, long, thin marks, ran from one end of the hallway to the other, as if something had been dragged across the wood. I followed them, heart pounding, all the way to the closet at the end of the hall. The door was open. I didn't remember leaving it that way. With trembling fingers, I reached for the handle and pulled it open wider. My clothes hung undisturbed. The shelves looked the same as always. But as I knelt down to inspect the floor, something caught my eye. The air vent near the back of the closet, it was slightly ajar. I swallowed hard. I had never touched that vent before. It had always been screwed shut. But now it was loose, as if someone had removed the cover and hastily put it back. A sickening thought formed in my mind. What if I wasn't dealing with something paranormal? What if someone was actually inside my house? Someone who had been hiding? I stared at the vent, my pulse thudding in my ears. The realization settled over me like a cold weight. This wasn't a ghost, wasn't my imagination. Someone had been inside my house, moving around while I slept. And worse, they might still be here. I forced myself to move, backing away from the closet and grabbing my phone. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, too calm, as I whispered that I thought someone was inside my home. She told me to stay in my room, lock the door, and wait for officers to arrive. But I couldn't just sit there. I needed to know. Baseball bat in hand, I took slow, careful steps toward the vent. My mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Had this person been here the whole time? How had they gotten in? And more importantly, where were they now? I knelt down and hesitated before gripping the vent cover. It was looser than I expected, barely held in place. With a soft tug, it came free. My stomach twisted as I peered inside. The vent shaft was dark, narrow, but deep enough that I couldn't see where it led. A faint draft of cold air brushed my face, carrying with it a smell that made my skin crawl. A mix of dust, dampness, and something else. Something foul. Then I saw it. Nestled inside the vent, just beyond the opening, was a small, dirty blanket. And beside it, a collection of food wrappers crumpled and stained. My breath caught in my throat. Someone had been living in my walls. A sudden noise behind me sent a jolt of terror through my body. A soft creak, coming from downstairs. My blood ran cold. Whoever had been hiding in my house, they weren't in the vent anymore. They were awake. I scrambled to my feet and rushed back to my room, slamming the door shut and locking it just as I heard footsteps below. Slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. I pressed myself against the door, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside my room. Silence. Then, a soft exhale, right on the other side of the door. I clamped a hand over my mouth, barely breathing. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but I was frozen in place. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the presence outside my door retreated. The footsteps moved back down the hall. A faint creak of the front door. And then nothing. Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights flooded through my window. I barely managed to unlock the door before collapsing in a mess of adrenaline and fear. The police searched the house from top to bottom. They found the vent setup, the wrappers, the blanket. But the person who had been living there? Gone. There was no sign of forced entry. No explanation for how they had come and gone without a trace. The only thing the officers could tell me was that whoever it was had been there for a long time. Long enough to know my habits. Long enough to walk my halls at night. Long enough to stand outside my door, listening. I moved out the next day. But sometimes, late at night, I still wake up to the sound of footsteps in the hall. And for a split second, I wonder, did I really leave them behind? The first time I saw the house, I knew I had to have it. It was an old Victorian with a wide front porch, stained glass windows, and a sprawling backyard. It needed work, but the price was almost too good to be true. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Walker, seemed eager to sell. But before I signed the papers, he told me something strange. "Never open the basement door after sunset," he said. I laughed, thinking it was some quirky superstition, but his face remained serious. "I mean it. Lock it every night. No matter what you hear." I should have asked more questions. I should have walked away, but I didn't. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. The house had its quirks. Strange noises in the pipes, floors that creaked in odd places, but nothing out of the ordinary for a home this old. I even forgot about Mr. Walker's warning. Until the night I heard it. A sound coming from the basement. I was in the living room reading when it started. A faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. I set my book down, listening. It was slow, rhythmic. Not an animal. Not the house settling. Something was scraping at the basement door. A chill ran through me. My first instinct was to ignore it. It had to be my imagination. But then the sound changed. A soft knock. I shot up from my chair, my pulse pounding. Came again 3 slow knocks. Deliberate. Expectant. I grabbed my phone, hovering over the call button. I wanted to believe it was a prank, but deep down, I knew better. No one else was in the house. The knocking stopped. For several long minutes, I stood frozen, barely breathing. Then, just as I began to convince myself I'd imagined it, I heard the worst sound of all. The click of the basement door unlocking. My stomach dropped. I hadn't touched the lock, hadn't even gone near the door. But somehow it had unlocked itself. I backed away slowly. I wasn't about to open that door. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the silence returned. No more scratching. No more knocks. Just the quiet hum of the house, as if nothing had happened. I forced myself to check the door. My hand trembled as I reached out. The knob was ice cold. I turned it, pushing gently. Still locked. But I knew what I had heard. I didn't sleep that night, and as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, a terrible thought crept into my mind. What would have happened if I had opened the door? The next morning, I told myself I had imagined it. Stress, lack of sleep, anything to explain away what happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that basement. I avoided it all day, left the house for hours, kept myself busy, anything to stop thinking about it. But as the sun began to set, an uneasy dread settled over me. Mr. Walker's warning echoed in my mind. Never open the basement door after sunset. I decided to take precautions. I checked the lock twice. I wedged a chair under the handle. Even grabbed a heavy-duty padlock from the hardware store and secured it tight. If the door unlocked again, I'd know something was seriously wrong. That night I lay in bed, listening. The house was silent. No knocks. No scratching. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. A whisper. Low. Almost a breath. Just beyond my bedroom door. I sat up, my skin prickling. I wasn't imagining this. Someone or something was there. Then came the sound that made my blood run cold. The creak of footsteps, moving down the hall, heading toward the basement. I held my breath, straining to listen. A soft click echoed from downstairs. My stomach twisted. The basement door had unlocked. I jumped out of bed, heart hammering. The chair. The padlock. How? I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and crept toward the stairs. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move. As I reached the bottom step, I saw it. The basement door was wide open, and inside something moved, a shifting shadow, tall, thin, standing just beyond the threshold. It wasn't facing me. It was crawling up the stairs. I didn't think, didn't breathe. I just ran. I slammed the door shut, threw the locks back into place, and pressed my body against it, shaking. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, 3 soft knocks. A whisper. Let me in. I didn't sleep that night, and as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I made a decision. I needed to know what was in that basement. I should have left, packed a bag and never looked back. But some sick, desperate part of me needed to know what was in that basement. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was obsession. The next day, I called a locksmith and had the basement door reinforced with a deadbolt. I didn't tell him why, just watched as he drilled the metal plate into place. "No one's getting through that," he said with a grin. I didn't smile back. That night, I sat in the living room, staring at the locked door. The house was silent. Hours passed. Nothing. Maybe whatever was down there had given up. Maybe it knew I wasn't going to open the door. Then, just after midnight, the air changed. A feeling of heaviness pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. The temperature dropped, and then, a single, slow knock. I gripped the armrest of my chair, frozen. Another knock, louder this time, and then, scratching. Not soft like before. This was violent, desperate. Nails dragging across wood, clawing at the door. It grew louder, more frantic, until it sounded like something was tearing at the other side, trying to get out. I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. The scratching turned into pounding, shaking the door in its frame. The deadbolt rattled. The walls trembled. Then silence. The door clicked. My breath caught. The deadbolt had unlocked. I watched in horror as the door inched open, revealing nothing but blackness beyond. The air that seeped from the basement was wrong, damp, stale, reeking of decay. Then I saw it. 2 hands emerged from the darkness, pale and skeletal, pulling the door open wider. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was in my bedroom with the door locked, barricaded, and my back pressed against it. My entire body shook as I listened. Slow, heavy footsteps moved through the house. A whisper slithered through the air, too quiet to make out. And then a knock on my bedroom door. I clenched my teeth, holding back a sob. Another knock. Then, the doorknob turned. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the door until the first light of dawn bled into the room. When I finally worked up the courage to check, the house was silent again. The basement door was shut. The deadbolt was back in place. But the wood was covered in deep, jagged scratches. That was the last night I spent in that house. I packed a bag and left, never looking back. I didn't try to sell it. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted out. Before I left town, I tried to contact Mr. Walker. I needed answers. But when I called the number he had given me, the voice on the other end was cold. "Mr. Walker?" The woman hesitated. "I'm sorry, but he passed away 3 years ago." I hung up without a word. I don't know what was in that basement. I don't want to know. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I still hear it. Knocking. Waiting. It started with a whisper. I was home alone, sitting in my living room, when I first heard it. A faint sound, almost like the wind slipping through the air vents. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, except sounded like a voice. I turned down the TV, listening. The whisper came again, drifting from the vent near the ceiling. A soft, unintelligible murmur. My first thought was that the ducks were carrying noise from outside, maybe even from a neighbor's house. But it didn't sound distant. It sounded close, right inside the walls. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just the house settling. But as the days passed, the whispers grew clearer, more distinct. And then one night, I heard something that made my skin crawl. A whisper, low, drawn out. But this time I understood what it said. Spoke my name. I bolted upright in bed, heart hammering. The voice had come from the vent above my desk. Soft, raspy, almost playful. I swallowed hard, trying to stay rational. Maybe I had misheard. Maybe it was my imagination. Then something moved inside the vent. A slow, deliberate scraping. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it toward the vent. The metal slats reflected the light back at me, revealing nothing unusual. But the air inside felt heavy, stale. And then I saw it. A faint mark in the dust. Something drawn onto the metal. My stomach twisted. The words hadn't been there before. They were fresh, as if someone had just written them. "We see you." A cold shiver crawled down my spine. I wasn't alone in this house, and whoever or whatever was in the vents knew I was listening. I stared at the words etched into the dust, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "We see you." The message wasn't old, it was fresh. Someone or something had just written it. A part of me wanted to run, to grab my keys and never look back. But my body refused to move. Instead, I did something I would regret. I whispered back, "Who's there?" Silence. Then, just as I was about to convince myself I had imagined it, I heard the whisper again. Closer. More distinct this time. "You know us." A sharp chill ran through me. My mind raced. Was someone living in my walls? A squatter? A prankster? But that voice, it wasn't normal. It was layered, distorted, wrong. And then, from inside the vent, something shifted. A thump, then another. The sound of something crawling. I leapt back, grabbing the heaviest object near me. A lamp, ready to defend myself. The air in the room felt thick, like the house itself was breathing. And then the voice spoke again. "Come closer." No, no way. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My entire body was trembling. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a prank. Something was in the vents, and it wanted me to listen. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined something slithering through the ductwork, pressing its face against the grates, watching me. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was going to check the vent. Really check it. I grabbed a screwdriver and stood beneath the vent cover, heart pounding. My hands shook as I unscrewed the metal plate, slowly pulling it free. Dust rained down. The dark, narrow shaft of the vent stretched into the shadows. I lifted my phone, shining the flashlight inside. The beam cut through the dust, illuminating the smooth metal walls. First, I saw nothing. Then my stomach dropped. A handprint. Not a normal one. It was too long. The fingers stretched unnaturally. The smudged outline dark against the metal. And just below it, more words. "Let us out." The whisper came again, so close it felt like it was coming from inside my own skull. "You opened the door." A sudden burst of movement deep in the vent made me stumble backward. Something was in there, and it was coming toward me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The air vent was too small for a person to fit inside, but something was moving toward me from the darkness. The scuttling sound was wrong. Too fast. Too eager. I didn't stay to see what it was. I grabbed the vent cover and slammed it back into place, fumbling with the screws, my shaking hands barely able to hold the screwdriver. The sound in the ductwork stopped. Just stopped. The silence was worse. I stood there, frozen, staring at the vent. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Slowly, I backed away, trying to convince myself that this was all in my head. I needed to leave. Get out of the house. Stay at a hotel. Call someone. But who? I reached for my phone, and the whisper returned. "You shouldn't have closed it." I choked on a breath. The voice was right behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing in my room. But there was nothing. No one. The room was empty, but the feeling wasn't gone. That awful, suffocating presence lingered. Watching. I bolted. I was done. I grabbed my keys and ran for the front door, heart hammering against my ribs. My hands shook so badly that I fumbled with the lock. My fingers barely gripped the handle before. Slam. The door shut on its own. I let out a startled gasp and yanked at the knob. It wouldn't budge. That's when I heard it again. The whisper. Don't go. You let us in. I spun around, pressing my back to the door, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Every vent in the house rattled at once. The sound filled the air like something was crawling through the walls, dozens of hands scratching at the metal, dozens of voices murmuring in an eerie, breathless harmony. Then the lights went out. The house plunged into suffocating darkness. I fumbled with my phone, turning on the flashlight, the beam shaking as I swept it across the room. And then I saw it. The vent in the hallway, the cover was off. Something was peeking out. A face. But it wasn't human. Its skin was stretched too tight, its mouth too wide, and its eyes, too many of them. They glistened in the dim light, black and soulless. The whispering rose into a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, all overlapping. Come inside, come inside, come inside. I let out a strangled cry and bolted toward the back door. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life. As I sped away, I glanced up at my house one last time, and in every single vent, they were watching me, hundreds of eyes, blinking, smiling. I never went back. I don't know what I let into my house that night. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I pass old buildings or hear the wind slip through an air vent, I swear I still hear them, still whispering, still waiting. When I was little, I always knew when Mom got home. Her routine never changed. Keys jingling in the door, the soft thud of her bag hitting the kitchen counter, the click of her heels as she walked down the hall. Then, without fail, she'd poke her head into my room and whisper, "Good night, sweetheart." It was comforting knowing she was there, knowing I wasn't alone. But one night when I was 8 years old, I heard those familiar sounds, and my mother was already home. That night, I had been lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard the front door open. The usual sounds followed. Keys, bag, footsteps. The steady rhythm of heels against the wooden floor, moving down the hall. I turned onto my side, waiting for the moment she'd appear in my doorway like always. But before she did, I heard something else. A soft shuffle from the hallway closet, like fabric shifting. The footsteps continued past my room, but something about them was off. Slower, uneven. I didn't know why, but my stomach twisted. Something in my mind whispered that something was wrong. Then, just as the footsteps stopped outside my door, I heard another sound. A voice, from down the hall. "Sweetie." I blinked, my skin turning ice cold. That was my mom's voice, but it wasn't coming from the doorway. It was coming from the other end of the house. I sat up, suddenly wide awake. My bedroom door was open just a crack, enough to see the shadow standing in the hallway. Too tall, too still. I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. Then, from the darkness, knuckles rapped against my door. Soft, patient, a whisper just like always. "Good night, sweetheart." My blood went cold, because at that exact moment, my real mother walked into the hallway behind it. She froze. Her face went pale. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Then, barely above a whisper, she said the words that still haunt me to this day. I heard it too. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air in the hallway felt thick, heavy with something I didn't understand. My mother stood at the far end of the corridor, eyes locked on my bedroom door, on the shadow standing just outside it. Then, without warning, the hallway light flickered, and the shadow moved. It didn't step away. It didn't retreat. It just slid back, noiselessly, into the darkness. The moment it disappeared, the light stopped flickering. The house fell silent. I barely registered my mother rushing forward, slamming my bedroom door shut, locking it. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst. "What was that?" I finally managed to whisper. My mother didn't answer right away. She stood there, her hand still gripping the doorknob, her face pale and unreadable. Then she turned to me, her voice barely above a breath. "I don't know." I could tell she was lying. That night, I slept in her bed. Or rather, I tried to. Neither of us really slept. Every few minutes, Mom would glance toward the door, her body tense, as if she were waiting for something. Hours passed. The sun rose, and just like that, the terror of the night before felt like a bad dream. But we both knew it wasn't. The next day, Mom took every precaution. She checked all the locks, every window, every closet. She even called our landlord, demanding to know if the house had some kind of history. Nothing unusual, he told her. But the last tenant left pretty suddenly. Didn't even take half their things. That wasn't comforting. That night, Mom didn't go to work. She didn't say it, but I knew she was afraid. So was I. Because deep down, I had a horrible feeling. Whatever had been outside my door last night, it wasn't gone. And it wasn't done with us. That night, we left every light on. The front door was locked. The windows were checked twice. Mom even pushed the heavy dresser in front of the hallway closet. Like that would stop something that had no footsteps. But as the night dragged on, I felt it. That awful presence. It wasn't outside the house. It was already inside. I was lying in bed, stiff under the blankets, when I heard it again. Not the door this time. Not the footsteps. Breathing. Soft. Shallow. Inside my room. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle in my body locking up. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see. Then, a familiar sound. The rustling of fabric. I felt the blood drain from my face. That sound, it was coming from my closet. The one Mom had checked hours ago. The air turned thick, suffocating. I lay perfectly still, heart pounding so loudly I thought it would give me away. And then, from inside the closet, knuckles rapped against the door. Soft, patient, exactly like the night before. Couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe. Then, the closet door slowly creaked open. I bolted upright, gasping, just as my mother burst into the room. Her face was twisted in terror, her eyes locked on the dark gap between the closet doors. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, just as she lunged forward to slam the closet shut, I saw it. A hand, reaching out. It was wrong, pale, too long, fingers stretched like they had too many joints. The skin was wrinkled, almost wet, like it had been soaking in something. Mom shoved the closet door closed with all her strength, locking it. Then she grabbed me, yanking me out of bed. "We're leaving." I didn't argue. We ran. Through the hallway, past the flickering lights, through the front door. As we reached the car, I risked a single glance back at the house. And I saw it. A shadow standing in my bedroom window. It didn't move. It didn't wave. But I knew, without a doubt, that it was smiling. We never went back. Mom broke the lease the next morning. We packed what we could in the daylight and left the rest behind. She never talked about it again. But sometimes, late at night, I still dream about that house. About the sound of the front door opening. The soft click of heels on the wooden floor. And that voice. "Good night, sweetheart." I always felt uneasy in my room, but I chalked it up to an overactive imagination. I was in my 20s, too old to be scared of the dark, too rational to believe in anything supernatural. But every night, just as I was about to drift off, an inexplicable sense of dread would settle over me. Like I wasn't alone. Like something was watching. I told myself it was just paranoia. That was until the night I woke up and saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The room was bathed in the faint orange glow of the streetlight outside, casting long shadows along the walls. But there, in the farthest corner of my room, was something darker than the shadows. A shape. It was tall. Unnaturally tall. A looming silhouette that didn't belong. I squinted, barely breathing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a pile of clothes, or a piece of furniture I had forgotten about. But then, it moved. Not a step. Not a shift. A slow, deliberate lean. Toward me. A bolt of terror shot through me. My fingers twitched against the sheets, but the rest of my body felt heavy, frozen in place. Sleep paralysis. That's what I told myself. That had to be it. I had read about it before, waking up and being unable to move, hallucinating things in the dark. That was all this was. But then it crawled closer. A soft, skittering sound filled the silence, like nails dragging against the floorboards. My breath caught in my throat. I could barely see its face, if it even had one, but I could feel it staring at me. It was inches from the bed now, close enough that if I reached out, I could have touched it. And then, from the darkness, I heard it. A whisper. "I know you see me." A deep, primal terror rooted me in place. The shadow loomed over me, its presence thick and suffocating, heavier than the darkness itself. My body refused to move, my breath came in shallow gasps, and my mind screamed at me to wake up, wake up, wake up. But I wasn't dreaming. The whisper had been real. The skittering sound against the floorboards had been real. And the thing crouching just inches from my bed. It was real. The air in the room turned ice cold. A slow, deliberate creak came from my mattress as the weight of something unseen pressed down at the foot of my bed. My fingers twitched against the sheets, but the rest of me was paralyzed, trapped between waking and dreaming, caught in a body that refused to obey. Then movement. The shadow's form shifted, inching closer. I could feel it hovering over me now, feel the unnatural wrongness radiating from it. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but I knew without a doubt that it was staring right at me. Another whisper, so close to my ear it sent a shiver through my entire body. "You see me now." And then, a single, ice-cold finger pressed against my forehead. A jolt of electric terror shot through me, and suddenly, my body was mine again. I gasped, jerking upright, my hands clawing at my skin, at my bed, at anything solid that could ground me back into reality. My heart was hammering in my chest, my skin damp with sweat. The room was empty. The corner where the shadow had been was just a corner again. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. The presence hadn't left. It was still there, watching, waiting, and I knew it would come back. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Even when the first hints of morning light crept through my window, I still sat upright in bed, my body tense, eyes locked on that corner. The thing, whatever it was gone. Or at least I couldn't see it anymore. But I could still feel it, like a pressure in the air, a presence just beyond my vision, waiting. By the time the sun fully rose, I convinced myself it had been sleep paralysis. A hallucination. It had to be. That was the rational explanation. But even as I tried to reason it away, I found myself avoiding the shadows, checking over my shoulder, flinching at every creak of the house. That night, I did something I had never done before. I left the lights on. I told myself it was just to be safe. Precaution. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was terrified of what would happen if I let the room go dark again. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. The warm glow of my bedside lamp bathed the room in light, and for the first time in a long while, I almost felt safe. Until the bulb flickered. My stomach twisted. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. The room hummed with an unnatural silence, the kind that makes your ears ring, like the whole house was holding its breath. The bulb flickered again, and then it went out. The room was plunged into darkness. And in the exact same moment, from the farthest corner of the room, a soft, shuddering breath. My body locked up. I knew what was happening before my eyes even adjusted. I didn't want to look, but I did, and the shadow was back. It was closer this time, so much closer, just a few feet from my bed, hunched and waiting. But now I could see its face, or rather the absence of one. Where its features should have been, there was nothing but a smooth, endless void. A gaping, black emptiness that seemed to swallow the light around it. And then it smiled. Not with a mouth, not with teeth. The whole shape of it twisted and stretched, distorting in a way that no human body should move, bending toward me in silent amusement. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but all I could do was stare. Then, it reached for me. I felt the weight of its fingers against my chest, pressing down, pinning me in place. A horrible cold seeped into my skin, burning where it touched. My vision blurred, my head spun, and for a moment, I thought, it's pulling me in. And just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The pressure vanished. The air in the room shifted, the suffocating heaviness lifting in an instant. My lamp flickered back to life. The room was empty. I gasped, sucking in deep, ragged breaths, my whole body shaking violently. My sheets were damp with sweat. My hands were ice cold. My chest still tingled where it had touched me. And then I saw it. My closet door. It was open, just a crack. And from the darkness inside, something moved.